The reason most people stay financially fragile has very little to do with intelligence. It has even less to do with whether they are hardworking. I have known brilliant people who made enormous incomes and still lived one bad month away from disorder. I have known modest earners who died with dignity, optionality, and enough set aside that the people they loved did not have to start from zero. The difference was almost never talent. It was not charisma. It was not that one group had discovered some secret corner of Wall Street. It was sequence. That is the line I want you to hold all the way through this story. Money rarely gets fixed by motivation. It gets fixed by sequence. That is the mother line for everything I am about to say. Most people do not have a money philosophy. They have money reactions. A bill shows up. They react. A pay raise lands. They react. A vacation looks tempting. They react. A tax bill arrives. They react. A debt balance feels ugly. They react. A market headline flashes red. They react. A budgeting app scolds them. They react. And reaction is a terrible way to build a life. You cannot build a house by showing up to the site every morning and reacting to whichever board looks loudest that day. You need an order foundation first. Frame next, wiring after that, plumbing after that. If you reverse the order, you do not get creativity, you get collapse. Money is the same way. Most people are trying to invest before they understand cash flow. They are trying to save before they understand what their life actually costs. They are trying to beat debt before they build a buffer. They are trying to automate without first deciding what deserves automation. They are trying to optimize a system that has never actually been defined. The source document you gave me understands that better than most financial content on the internet. It says the mistake most people make is stopping at step 2 and then wondering why step 5 never works. That is exactly right. Financial systems are sequential. Skip a load, bearing piece early, and the later pieces become much harder than they were supposed to be. Fay file site. Fay turn 60, file 0. Fay, that is the first rule. A financial plan fails fastest when the steps are correct individually but wrong in order. So let us rebuild the order, not as a cute list, as a system. The first thing you must know is not your salary. It is your real income. That sounds almost childish in its simplicity, which is exactly why people miss it. They use the number printed on the offer letter. They use gross salary divided by 12. They use the number that flatters them at dinner. They use the number that lets them say, I make 6 figures, while their actual monthly life is being funded by something far smaller. That is fiction. And fiction is expensive. The source gets this exactly right. If you are an employee, the number that matters is the amount that actually lands in your account after tax. If there are pre-tax retirement contributions or workplace pension contributions disappearing before the net amount hits, then those need to be recognized too, because they are still part of the full income picture. If you are self-employed, the danger is even worse, because the money entering the business account is not automatically your money at all. Some of it already belongs to the government, even if you have not handed it over yet. Budgeting against gross business revenue is one of the fastest ways for self-employed people to feel rich for a season and cleaned out when tax season arrives. Fay file a site, Fay turn 60, file 0 Fay. That is why I say accounting is not merely the language of business. It is the language of self-respect. A person who does not know what is actually his cannot possibly make intelligent decisions about what to do next. I call this the reality line. The reality line is the actual after tax income truly available to support your life after separating employer withholdings, retirement contributions, and tax obligations from flattering but unusable gross numbers. That line is where honesty begins. Not because it feels good, because every later decision depends on it. Now, the second thing most people hate doing is also the second thing that changes everything. Write down where the money goes. Again, the idea sounds too basic to impress anyone, which is why it remains one of the most underused powers in personal finance. People want a clever answer, a product, a tax shelter, a side hustle trick, a perfect ETF, a psychological reframe. Something interesting enough that it lets them skip the embarrassment of looking at the actual outflow. Numbers start with the outflow. The source is wonderful on this point. Pull the statements, pull the bank feeds, pull the credit card records, use the bank S categories if you must. But verify them, because banks misclassify things constantly and forgotten subscriptions love to hide in vague categories. People think this step is humiliating. Good. A little humiliation at the truth is much cheaper than years of vague anxiety about numbers you refuse to see. Faithfully cite Turn 60 File 0 Fe. I have always believed vague fear is one of the most expensive emotional states in money. A specific problem can be solved. A vague one just eats energy. That is why the act of laying out spending is not punishment. It is translation. You are translating emotional blur into visible structure. And then the source does something very smart with that structure. 3 buckets: fundamentals, lifestyle, future. This is better than a lot of budgeting systems because it restores meaning. Fundamentals are the expenses that keep life standing, even if income gets wounded. Housing, groceries, utilities, transport, insurance, basic survival. Lifestyle is not evil, that matters. Restaurants, travel, streaming, clothes beyond necessity, leisure, the good parts of living. Future you is the bucket. Most people chronically starve. Emergency fund, debt acceleration, investing, retirement savings, all the money that protects or enlarges the future instead of merely maintaining the present. Faithfully Turn 60 File 0 Fe. That framing matters because most people do not actually have a spending problem in the moral sense. They have a visibility problem. They do not know how much of their money is feeding the machine of their current life versus how much is actually buying future stability. Once the buckets exist, that question becomes impossible to avoid. I call this the 3-bucket truth. The 3-bucket truth is the moment when a person sees clearly how much income is consumed by survival, how much is being spent for pleasure, and how little or how much is being directed to the future. That truth can be painful, but pain with shape is still better than drift. Now let us speak about one of the most repeated and least context-sensitive phrases in all of modern personal finance. 50-30-20. The source is right to attack it. And I want to sharpen the attack. The 50 divided by 30 divided by 20 rule was born in a different cost world. Housing costs were lower relative to wages. Energy was lower. Real wage growth had not been as stagnant. The rule survived because it was tidy, not because reality stayed tidy. The source points out exactly what most adults already know in their bodies. In many places, the fundamentals bucket is consuming 65-70, even 80% of income for entirely ordinary households. That does not automatically mean those households are reckless. It means the economy changed faster than the slogan did. Faithfully Turn 60 File 0 Fe. That does not make the framework worthless. It makes it diagnostic instead of prescriptive. This is a very important distinction. If your fundamentals are 70%, the rule is not there to shame you for failing. It is there to tell you something specific. Your margin is thin. Surprises are more dangerous. Your need for an emergency buffer is greater. Your need for intentional lifestyle spending is higher, not lower. If your lifestyle bucket is swallowing 35 or 40% while future you is nearly empty, then the framework tells you something else. You have room, but your priorities are misaligned. That is useful information. It is not a verdict on character. Faithfully Turn 60 File 0 Fe. I call this the margin test. The margin test is the use of broad budgeting ratios, not as laws to obey mechanically, but as indicators of how much room exists between the cost of your present and the protection of your future. That is much more intelligent than worshiping ratios designed for another era. And now we come to what most people want to skip because it sounds boring until the month it saves them. The emergency fund. I have seen people with brokerage accounts, retirement accounts, option bets, individual stocks, and opinions about inflation who still had no real emergency fund. They knew words like diversification and compound growth and time in the market, and then one transmission failure or medical bill or pay cut forced them to liquidate at the wrong time or slide right back onto a credit card. That is not investing. That is living electrically with no circuit breaker. The source says this perfectly. The emergency fund is not just savings with a nicer label. It is a circuit breaker. It is the thing that stops one bad week from turning into 6 months of backward motion. Without it, all the beautiful later steps are one small shock away from being ripped up. Fe file a site, fe turn 60 file 0 fe. That is the second rule. Without an emergency fund, every other part of your plan is fragile theater. Now, there is a subtlety here that many advisors miss and that the source handles very well. Do not begin with 6 months. Begin with 1. This is psychologically brilliant and financially sound. Telling someone living close to the edge that he needs $18,000 before he can breathe is not motivation. It is paralysis. The source understands that. Start with 1 month of fundamental expenses, not total spending, not aspirational comfort. The true survival number, the bucket 1 number. That target is close enough to feel real, and the confidence produced by hitting it is often the first genuine evidence the person has that his financial life can actually be influenced by his own actions. Fe file a site, fe turn 60 file 0, fe I call this the 1, month anchor the 1. Month anchor is the first emergency, fund target built around survival, level expenses. Size to be psychologically reachable so momentum can begin. Before perfection is demanded. This is where so much modern self-help gets money wrong. It confuses noble goals with useful goals. Useful goals are the ones a human being can attack without freezing. Once the 1 month anchor is built, you grow toward 3. Then 6. But first you prove to your nervous system that money no longer owns every surprise, that proof is priceless. Now let us go to the place where most financial pain actually compounds fastest, debt. And here again the source is excellent because it strips away the fake morality and goes straight to structure. Debt is not sinful. Debt is directional. That is what matters. Some debt expands earning power or secures long-lived utility at tolerable cost. Some debt bleeds you for years to finance things you barely remember buying. The source is interested mostly in the hemorrhage version. And so am I, because that is what ruins the system for most households. Fe file a site, fe turn 60 file 0 fe here is the brutal truth. You do not need the stock market to earn 20% annually. If you are paying 22% on credit cards, you have already found your guaranteed 22%. It is called eliminating the debt. That is why the source S distinction between high interest and low interest debt matters so much. High interest consumer debt is an emergency, not in the dramatic emotional sense, but in the mathematical sense. While you are slowly building cash at 4%, a 22% card balance is breeding against you. In that specific case, the source gives the right sequence. Build a minimal buffer first. Call it $500 to $1,000 enough that a tiny emergency does not immediately become another swipe, and then attack the high interest debt with force low. Interest debt is a different creature and can coexist with a fuller emergency fund more easily. Fe file a site, fe turn 60 file 0 fe, this is grown up. Planning, not debt fundamentalism, not debt denial structure, and then the source does the thing I respect most. It forces the borrower to write it all down. Creditor, balance, interest rate, minimum payment. That is so simple people dismiss it, but writing debt down changes it from fog into sequence. Once the numbers are visible, the person can choose a strategy instead of living inside dread. Avalanche or snowball, save the most interest or maximize the number of visible wins. I do not much care which one a person chooses if he actually uses it. What I cannot respect is random payments driven by whichever email or wave of guilt arrived last. That is the most expensive method, because it combines the highest confusion with the lowest momentum. Fe file a site, fe turn 60 file 0 fe I call this the debt map. The debt map is the full written layout of balances, rates, and minimums that transforms a vague burden into a solvable sequence. And this is where the third rule comes in: specific debt is beatable. Vague debt owns you. That sentence applies to almost everything in finance, but nowhere more than here. Now let us move to what happens after the bleeding stops, because this is another place where people go wrong. They think the story is over when the debt is gone. The system is only now ready to become strong. Once the high interest drag is eliminated and the 1-month anchor exists, then the emergency fund grows toward 3 to 6 months. The source is excellent on the placement question too. Separate bank, high yield account, easy enough to access in real emergency, hard enough to touch that temptation, has a small wall in front of it. That friction is not inconvenience, it is design. Fay turn 60, file 0 Fay. I like that framing because personal finance fails when it assumes human beings should simply become morally stronger all the time. That is a stupid design standard. Better to make the right behavior easy and the wrong behavior slightly annoying. That is what systems do. Systems replace heroic discipline with engineered defaults. And now finally, we reach the part everybody wants to start with on day one: building, investing, retirement accounts, compounding. This is where the source is right to force employer match to the front of the line. If your employer offers a match and you are not taking it, you are not being conservative. You are refusing compensation. There are very few clean 100% return moves in ordinary life. This is one of them. Capture the match. Then use the tax-advantaged accounts available to you. IRA, Roth, ESA, SIP, whatever the local structure is, because the tax wrapper is not administrative trivia. Over decades, it changes the entire growth path. Fay turn 60. File 0 Fay. This is the fourth rule. Before trying to be clever with investing, first stop refusing free money and legal tax shelter. It is amazing how many people want advanced strategy while leaving the most obvious structural advantage untouched. That is ego, not finance. Then comes the next distinction the source handles. Well, saving is storage, investing is deployment. This is one of the clearest sentences in the entire file, and it deserves to be remembered. A savings account is where you keep near-term stability, a 1 to 3 year goal, down payment, emergency reserve, known spending horizon. Investing is where you place money that can tolerate a 5-year plus horizon and some volatility in exchange for real growth. Confuse the time horizon and you create pain. Invest short-term money and you may be forced to sell badly. Save long. Term money and cash and inflation quietly steals years from you. Fay turn 60, file 0. I call this the horizon match. The horizon match is the practice of aligning the tool, savings, or investing with the actual time period before the money is likely to be needed. This sounds basic. It is basic, which is why it ruins so many people when ignored. Now, let us talk about investing itself. The source says the right thing and says it plainly. Simplicity beats complexity more often than not. Low-cost index funds, broad market exposure, minimal fees, consistent contributions, patience. Most of the people trying to be smarter than that end up paying fees, taxes, or behavioral penalties for the privilege of feeling active. The real enemy is not volatility. It is human behavior under volatility. Panic selling, strategy, jumping, chasing whatever looked brilliant last year. The discipline to do less, longer, is worth more than most people's entire stock. Picking skill set, Fay turn 60, file 0 Fay. I agree with that completely. Because wealth is usually not built by selecting the cleverest line item. It is built by not interrupting the right line item for decades. Now let me say something that the source says well near the end and that more financial educators should say out loud sooner. Money behavior is emotional before it is rational. This is one of the deepest truths in all of personal finance. People do not avoid their numbers because spreadsheets are hard. They avoid them because the numbers feel like accusation. People do not always keep debt because they do not know the interest rate is bad. They keep it because paying it down requires sacrificing present comfort for a future that still feels abstract. People do not always delay investing because there is not enough information. We live in the richest age of free financial information in human history. They delay because starting would require them to admit that they have not started yet. And admission carries emotional cost. Fay turn 60, file 0 Fay. That is why I think willpower is deeply overrated. Willpower is a spark. Systems are wiring. A life cannot run on sparks forever. so the source ends in exactly the right place. Automation. Automate the savings transfer when income lands. Automate the investment contribution. Move the emergency fund to a different bank. Reduce the number of monthly decisions requiring moral heroism. That is not laziness. That is wisdom. Fay file a site, Fay turn 60 file 0. Fay I call this the friction design. The friction design is the deliberate arrangement of financial life so that good behaviors happen with minimal ongoing effort and bad behaviors require just enough resistance to interrupt impulse. That is what adults do. Let's put as they are weak, because they know that moods are not a stable source of wealth. This is the fifth rule. The financially sound choice should be made easy enough that it does not depend on your mood. That one principle can change almost everything. Now let me pull the whole sequence together the way it should have been taught to people in the first place. First, define the reality line. Know what truly belongs to you each month after tax and after all hidden deductions are surfaced. Second, build the three-bucket truth. Know what keeps you alive, what you choose for pleasure, and what serves your future. Third, use the margin test rather than outdated slogans to understand how fragile or flexible your current structure really is. Fourth, create the one. Month anchor. Fifth, build the debt map and eliminate high interest hemorrhage with discipline. Sixth, expand the emergency system to 3 to 6 months. Seventh, capture the match in the tax shelters before you entertain sophisticated ideas. Eighth, match horizons properly. Ninth, automate the whole machine so your better self keeps working even when your daily self is tired. That is not 9 random tips. That is one system. And the system works because each step makes the next step sturdier. That is what most people miss. They want the sexy step, the investing step, the freedom step, the compounding step. But if they have not installed the earlier pieces, the later pieces remain unstable. That is why the source is so good to insist that reading the steps is not the same as running them. Fay file site, Fay turn 60 file 0. Fay reading is not execution. Agreement is not execution. Intellectual understanding is not execution. The gap between knowing and doing is where most financial plans quietly die. That sentence should haunt people a little because it is true. Now let me tell you the identity shift hidden inside this whole file. Most people think they need to become better with money. What they actually need is to stop treating money as a collection of emergencies and start treating it as a sequence. That is the shift from reactive spender to system operator. A reactive spender responds to whatever feels loudest this month. A system operator knows the order and protects the order. A reactive spender wants motivation. A system operator wants architecture. A reactive spender feels guilt. A system operator creates structure. That is a far better way to live, not because it is glamorous, because it is repeatable, and repeatability is what wealth really requires. If I were compressing the whole lesson of this source into one final sentence, it would be this. Financial freedom does not begin when you earn more. It begins when you finally stop improvising. That is when the system begins. That is when chaos starts losing. And that is when money stops being a monthly emergency and starts becoming a long-term ally.